Throughout history, the world has seen its fair share of scary people who seem to lack the ability to empathize with others. They choose instead to exploit their victims towards their own selfish gains, and very often, when they are finally brought to justice, show no remorse for their actions whatsoever. Number 5. Thomas Silverstein was just 19 years old when he was arrested for armed robbery and sent to San Quentin prison. He would spend the next 4 years behind bars before being paroled in 1975, but soon after, he would be arrested again. This time, he had been part of 3 armed robberies along with his father, Thomas Conway, and his cousin, Gerald Hoff. He would ultimately be sentenced to 15 years behind bars to be served at the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. While incarcerated at Leavenworth, he joined an Aryan gang and was in the business of smuggling illegal substances into the prison. Silverstein approached a fellow inmate, Danny Atwell, to recruit him as a smuggling mule, but when Atwell refused, Silverstein ended his life. This would lead to him receiving a life sentence and being transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois. This conviction would, however, be overturned when it came to light that the jailhouse informants who had testified against him had perjured themselves at the trial. While serving time in prison, Silverstein was housed in the control unit, which is an area reserved for problematic inmates who are prone to be disruptive and violent. In 1981, he received yet another life sentence after he and a fellow inmate, Clayton Fountain, were found guilty of ending the life of Robert Chappelle, who was a rival gang member, though Silverstein maintained that he was innocent. While on trial in the Chappelle case, Raymond Lee Smith, the national leader of the rival gang, was transferred to the same unit that Silverstein was in, and he threatened to end Silverstein's life in revenge. But Silverstein and Fountain ended his life too, and he received his 3rd life term. On the 22nd of October, 1983, Silverstein was let out of his cell for a shower, and while being led there, tricked correction officer Merle Klotz into walking in front of him. He then stopped outside the cell of a fellow inmate, Randy Gomez, who managed to unlock Silverstein's cuffs with a homemade key and passed him a crudely made blade. Silverstein then attacked and ended the life of Klotz, explaining afterwards that he did it because Klotz was deliberately harassing him and because he had destroyed several of his paintings. The same strategy was used a few hours later by Clayton Fountain to end another officer's life, causing the prison to go into indefinite lockdown, which lasted for 23 years. Silverstein was then transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, where he stayed in solitary confinement for the next 36 years. Number 4. K.D. Kimama is widely reported as being India's first ever convicted female serial killer. She lived on the outskirts of Bangalore with her husband, who was a tailor. K.D. ran her own chit finance business, but when the business went under, her husband left her and she was thrown out of her family home. She then had no choice but to work odd jobs, which included becoming a domestic worker and the assistant to a goldsmith. She would take advantage of her position as a domestic worker to rob some of the houses that she was employed at. In 1999, she had become desperate and devised a plan to end her financial woes. She would wait outside of temples and look out for women who seemed to be in distress. She would then befriend them by promising them relief from their problems through a holy ritual. She would portray herself to be deeply religious, and after gaining their trust, she would ask the women to meet her at another temple. She would stipulate that they needed to be dressed in their best clothing, and that they needed to adorn themselves with jewelry. Once her victims arrived at the temple, she would tell them to close their eyes and give them holy water to drink or food to eat. Unbeknownst to the women, The water and food was laced with cyanide, which KD got from jewelry shops where it was used to clean jewelry. Once her victims passed away, she would rob them of their clothes and jewelry. In 2008, she was finally arrested at a bus stand while trying to sell the jewelry that she had stolen from her victims, and she immediately confessed. She was sentenced to life in prison. Number 3. John Bunting from Adelaide is known as Australia's worst ever serial killer. The crimes that he committed, together with Robert Wagner, James Vlasaki, and Mark Hayden between 1992 and 1999, resulted in the longest trial in South Australia's history, which lasted for nearly 12 months. Bunting married Vlasaki's mother, and hence became his father figure. He then befriended Wagner and Hayden, who were his neighbors in 1991, and the four men began to target people who were close to them. In 1992, Bunting invited 22-year-old Clinton Trezise to his house for a visit. Shortly after the man arrived, he used a shovel to end his life. His body would, however, not be found until August of 1994. Their second victim was an intellectually challenged man named Ray Davies. He lived in a caravan behind the house of a woman named Suzanne Allen, who was his ex-girlfriend. His life was ended in December of 1995, and he wasn't found until 1999. The third victim, Michael Gardiner's life was ended in 1997, and after the fact, Bunting instructed a man named Frederick Brooks to impersonate Gardiner and to contact the man's friends, asking them to hand over his belongings, such as his wallet. This was done so that Bunting could gain access to Gardiner's personal funds. They then turned their attention to an ex-partner of Wagner's, a man named Barry Lane. Bunting forced him to contact his mother and tell her that he was moving to Queensland, and that he didn't want any further contact with her. Lane had helped Bunting into hiding Clinton Trezise's body, and Bunting found out that he'd been talking about the crime. After his life was ended, Bunting assumed ownership of Lane's car and claimed his welfare payments. The men would go on to end the lives of a further 7 people. When they were finally arrested, Bunting, Wagner, and Hayden were charged with the crimes, while Vlasaki pleaded guilty and provided testimony to have his sentence reduced. Bunting would ultimately receive 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole after a judge determined that he was the ringleader. Wagner received 10 consecutive life terms. Vlasaki received 4 life terms, and Hayden received 25 years behind bars. Number 2. Henry Lee Lucas was one of 9 siblings. He was born in a one-room log cabin in Blacksburg, Virginia in 1936, and at the age of 10, he lost one of his eyes when it became infected after he'd gotten into a fight with his brother, and his alcoholic mother didn't see any need to have it treated. Lucas's father, who was also an alcoholic, had lost his legs in a railroad accident, and was often a victim to violent beatings from his wife, who worked as a street worker. He passed away in 1949 after he passed out in a snowstorm. In 1959, Lucas moved in with his half-sister, Opal, in Michigan. At the time, he was engaged to a woman who he had become pen pals with while he was incarcerated for a spate of robberies that he committed. When his mother visited him to celebrate Christmas, she informed him that she didn't approve of his fiancée, and that it would be better if he moved back to Blacksburg so that he could take care of her as she aged. This caused a series of arguments between them that escalated when she struck him over the head with a broom. He lost his temper and attacked her with a blade before fleeing. Opal returned home later and found her still alive on the floor, but she would soon pass away before an ambulance could reach her. Lucas was eventually arrested in Ohio, and he claimed self-defense, but this was rejected, and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. He was released after just 10 years due to prison overcrowding. After spending more time in prison, he lived with various family members before settling in Florida. Here, he worked as a roofer and mechanic. In June of 1983, he was arrested by a Texas Ranger on charges of unlawful possession of a weapon, and he would confess to ending the lives of 2 more people. In November of that same year, he was transferred to a jail in Williamson County, Texas, where he confessed to ending the lives of 213 more people. Though these confessions have been questioned, as he was promised and given preferential treatment for each confession. Despite uncertainty of the number of victims that he actually had, Lucas served a life sentence until he passed away on the 12th of March of 2001. Number 1. Orville Majors lived in Kentucky as a teen in 1961, where he took care of his elderly grandmother. This experience led to him pursuing a career in nursing, and he graduated from Nashville Memorial School of Practical Nursing in 1989. He started work at Vermilion County Hospital in Clinton, leaving for a short period to work at a higher-paying job in Tennessee, before returning in 1993. Here, he became one of the more popular nurses, especially with his elderly patients, who gave him very good evaluations. But upon his return, the death rate at the hospital spiked from 26 in the previous year to over 100 per year, and his fellow nurses started to become suspicious. They noticed that some patients would pass away from an erratic heartbeat following respiratory arrest, which was not normal, while others perished from conditions that were not present when they were admitted. Eventually, they started noticing a pattern where patients would pass away while Majors was on duty, and in 1995, nursing supervisor Don Styrick compared Majors' time cards to the fatalities and found that he was on duty when 130 of the 147 deaths occurred. She alerted hospital officials who contacted the Indiana State Police. Upon investigation, it was found that when Majors was on duty, a patient would pass away every 23 hours, whether he was working on weekdays or weekends. When he was off duty, the rate dropped to 1 every 23 days, meaning that a patient was 42 times more likely to pass away while he was working. Majors denied any wrongdoing and appeared on talk shows to proclaim his innocence. But after a former roommate of Majors recalled seeing vials of potassium chloride and epinephrine in their house, she informed police, who obtained a search warrant and found several vials that were traced back to the hospital. He was ultimately arrested in December of 1997 and charged with ending the lives of 7 patients, although police do believe he was responsible for over 100 fatalities. Prosecutors only focused on 7 cases so that the jury wouldn't be overwhelmed. In 1999, 79 people testified at his trial, with some stating that they believed Majors had a hatred of the elderly, and that he should receive the death penalty. On the 17th of October, he was sentenced to 360 years in prison. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.